The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Buckingham Palace as Camilla Parker Bowles quietly made her way through the East Wing corridors. Her footsteps echoed softly against the ornate walls, each step calculated and deliberate. In her hands she clutched a small leather suitcase, its worn edges telling stories of previous journeys to distant lands. The Queen Consort had been planning this departure for weeks, carefully coordinating every detail to ensure her escape would go unnoticed. The weight of royal duties had become unbearable, pressing down on her shoulders like an invisible crown made of lead. Every public appearance, every ceremonial obligation, every carefully scripted interaction had drained her spirit until she felt like a shadow of her former self. Her destination was a small cottage in the French countryside, a place she had discovered during a private visit years ago. The elderly couple who owned it had no idea of her true identity, knowing her only as Mrs. Cornwall, a quiet English woman who appreciated their simple way of life. There, among the lavender fields and rolling hills, she could find the peace that had eluded her within the palace walls. As she approached the servants' entrance, Camilla's heart raced with a mixture of excitement and terror. This was not just a vacation or a brief respite from royal life. This was an attempt to reclaim her humanity, to remember who she was before the titles and expectations consumed her identity. The letter she had left on her writing desk explained everything to Charles, though she doubted he would understand her need for freedom. The corridor seemed endless as she walked, her mind replaying the events that had led to this moment. The constant scrutiny from the press, the endless criticism from royal watchers, and the suffocating protocol that governed every aspect of her existence had finally broken her resolve. She remembered the woman she used to be, someone who could laugh freely, speak her mind, and make choices without considering their impact on the monarchy. Her personal maid, Sarah, had been the only person aware of her plans. The young woman had tearfully helped pack the essentials, understanding her mistress's desperation even if she couldn't comprehend the full magnitude of what Camilla was attempting. Together they had carefully selected clothes that wouldn't draw attention, simple garments that would allow her to blend into the countryside like any other visitor. The palace felt different in these early morning hours, as if it too was holding its breath. The usual bustle of staff preparing for another day of royal engagements had not yet begun, leaving the ancient building in an almost sacred silence. Camilla had chosen this time deliberately, knowing that the changing of the guard would provide her with the smallest window of opportunity to slip away undetected. As she reached the final corridor before the exit, memories flooded her mind, unbidden. She thought of her children, now grown and living their own lives, who had watched their mother transform from a private person into a public figure with grace and dignity. They had supported her journey, even when it meant sharing their mother with an entire nation. The guilt of leaving without saying goodbye gnawed at her, but she knew they would try to stop her if they knew. The leather suitcase in her hand contained more than just clothes and personal items. Hidden within its silk-lined compartments were photographs of happier times, letters from friends who had known her before her royal life, and a small notebook filled with her private thoughts and dreams. These items represented the fragments of her true self that she had managed to preserve throughout her years as a royal. Her relationship with Charles had evolved over the decades, weathering storms that would have destroyed most marriages. Yet lately, she felt as though they were living parallel lives connected by duty and obligation, rather than the love that had once sustained them. The weight of their shared responsibilities had created a distance between them that seemed impossible to bridge. The plan was simple in its execution, but complex in its implications. A hired car waited 3 blocks away from the palace, its driver believing he was picking up a diplomatic aide for a routine journey to Dover. From there, she would take the ferry to Calais, just another passenger among hundreds making the crossing. Her French was passable enough to avoid suspicion, and her appearance, freed from the formal styling of royal life, would render her virtually invisible. Standing before the heavy wooden door that would lead to her freedom, Camilla paused to consider the magnitude of her decision. Behind her lay a life of privilege and purpose, a role that millions of people looked up to and respected. Ahead lay uncertainty, potential scandal, and the possibility of never being able to return to the life she had known for so many years. The morning air felt crisp against her skin as she finally pushed open the door, Stepping into the palace gardens where she had spent countless hours in contemplation, the familiar scent of roses mingled with the fresh breeze, creating a bittersweet reminder of all she was leaving behind. Her fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted her grip on the suitcase, the weight of her decision making her movements feel surreal. In the distance, she could see the gates that separated the palace grounds from the outside world. Beyond those barriers lay London, awakening to another ordinary day, unaware that one of its most prominent residents was attempting to slip away into anonymity. The irony was not lost on her that freedom lay just beyond the very walls that had protected and imprisoned her for so many years. Each step toward the gate felt like a small victory, a reclamation of her autonomy that had been gradually surrendered over the years. The gravel crunched beneath her sensible walking shoes, a sound that seemed to announce her liberation to the sleeping gardens around her. Soon, she told herself, she would be sitting in that cottage kitchen drinking coffee from a simple ceramic mug while watching the sunrise paint the French countryside in shades of gold and amber. The palace gates loomed ahead of Camilla like ancient sentinels, their ornate ironwork gleaming in the early morning light. She had passed through these gates countless times, always in official vehicles surrounded by security details, but never alone, and never with such desperate purpose. Her breathing became shallow as she approached the guardhouse, knowing that this moment would determine whether her carefully laid plans would succeed or crumble. Sergeant William Hayes had been standing guard at the palace gates for over 15 years, his keen eyes trained to notice anything unusual or out of place. The early morning shift was typically quiet, with only essential staff arriving for their duties, but something about the solitary figure approaching from within the palace grounds caught his attention immediately. The woman walked with purpose, yet there was something furtive about her movements that set off his professional instincts. As Camilla drew closer, Hayes squinted through the morning shadows, his training kicking in automatically. The figure was well-dressed but attempting to appear casual, carrying what appeared to be luggage, and moving with the kind of deliberate stealth that suggested someone trying not to be noticed. When she stepped into the pool of light cast by the guard station, his breath caught in his throat as recognition dawned. The queen consort was attempting to leave the palace grounds alone, without security, without an official escort, and clearly without authorization. Hayes had been briefed on royal protocols countless times throughout his career, and this situation was unprecedented. His hand instinctively moved toward his radio, but years of military discipline prevented him from acting hastily. Instead, he stepped forward, positioning himself directly in her path. Camilla's heart sank as she saw the guard move to intercept her. She had hoped the early hour would mean a skeletal security presence, perhaps a single guard who might not recognize her without her usual formal attire and styling. But the man approaching her had the sharp eyes of a career military professional, and she could see in his expression that her identity was no mystery to him. Hayes approached with respectful but firm determination, his posture conveying both deference to her royal status and unwavering commitment to his duty. The morning air was thick with tension as the two figures faced each other near the gates, the weight of protocol and human desire creating an almost palpable conflict in the space between them. The guard's voice was steady but gentle when he spoke, recognizing the delicate nature of the situation. He could see the desperation in her eyes, the way her fingers gripped the suitcase handle with white-knuckled intensity, and the slight tremor in her composure that suggested this was not a casual departure. Years of royal service had taught him to read the subtle signs of distress, even when they were carefully masked by dignity and breeding. Camilla attempted to maintain her composure, drawing upon decades of royal training to project calm authority, even as her escape plan unraveled before her eyes. She explained that she was simply taking a morning walk, but the suitcase in her hand made this explanation transparently false. The guard's expression remained respectful but skeptical, his duty clearly preventing him from accepting her improvised story. The standoff continued for several tense minutes, with neither party willing to yield their position. Hayes understood that he was witnessing something extraordinary, a moment when the carefully constructed facade of royal life was cracking to reveal the human being beneath. His training told him to detain her and immediately contact his superiors, but his compassion recognized the profound unhappiness that had driven her to this desperate measure. As they spoke, other palace staff began to arrive for their morning duties, and Camilla realized that her window of opportunity was rapidly closing. The longer she remained at the gates, the more likely it became that word of her attempted departure would spread throughout the palace, making any future escape attempts impossible. The weight of her failure settled over her like a heavy cloak, and she felt tears threatening to betray her carefully maintained composure. Hayes found himself in an impossible position, torn between his sworn duty to protect the royal family and his growing understanding of the human cost of that protection. He could see that the queen consort was not attempting to flee from danger, but rather toward some semblance of personal freedom. The irony that his role as protector was now that of captor was not lost on him. The conversation between them became increasingly strained, as Camilla realized that persuasion would not work. The guard was too professional, too committed to his duties to be swayed by emotional appeals or royal authority. She began to understand that her carefully planned escape had been doomed from the start, that the very security measures designed to protect her had become an inescapable prison. Other guards began to take notice of the unusual situation, and Hayes knew that the matter would soon be out of his hands entirely. He could see the panic beginning to creep into Camilla's eyes as she realized that her desperate bid for freedom was collapsing around her. The morning that had begun with such hope and determination was quickly becoming a nightmare of exposure and failure. The weight of protocol demanded that Hayes take action, but his human instincts urged him to find some way to help this clearly suffering woman. He had served the royal family faithfully for years, witnessing their public triumphs and private struggles, and he could see that this moment represented something far more significant than a simple security breach. As more palace staff appeared in the distance, Camilla knew that her opportunity had passed. The suitcase that had represented freedom and possibility now felt like evidence of her failure, its weight seeming to increase with each passing moment. The gates that had seemed so close to opening now appeared more formidable than ever, their iron bars catching the morning light like the boundaries of an elegant cage. The approaching footsteps of additional security personnel marked the end of her escape attempt, and Camilla felt the last vestiges of hope slip away like morning mist. She looked at Hayes with a mixture of disappointment and understanding, recognizing that he was simply doing his job, even if that job had just shattered her dreams of freedom. The sound of approaching footsteps on gravel echoed through the morning air, as additional palace security converged on the gate area. Sergeant Hayes watched as his colleague, Inspector Morrison, approached with measured urgency, clearly having been alerted to the unusual situation. The inspector's weathered face showed years of experience dealing with delicate royal matters, but even his seasoned demeanor reflected surprise at finding the queen consort attempting an unauthorized departure. Camilla stood frozen between the two guards, her escape route now completely blocked. The leather suitcase felt impossibly heavy in her grasp, as she realized the full extent of her predicament. Word of this incident would inevitably reach Charles, the palace staff, and potentially the press if security protocols required formal documentation. Her private moment of rebellion was rapidly becoming a very public failure. Inspector Morrison approached with careful diplomacy, his voice calm and professional as he addressed the situation. He had served the royal household for nearly 2 decades and had developed an almost paternal protective instinct toward family members. Seeing the queen consort in such obvious distress triggered both his security training and his human compassion, creating an internal conflict about how to proceed. The conversation that followed was conducted in hushed tones, with Morrison attempting to understand the circumstances while Hayes maintained his position. Camilla found herself having to explain her actions to men who had devoted their careers to protecting her, making the situation feel even more surreal and humiliating. The irony of being trapped by her own security detail was not lost on her. As they spoke, Morrison's trained eye cataloged the contents visible through the partially open suitcase. He could see personal clothing, photographs, and what appeared to be travel documents, confirming that this was indeed a serious escape attempt rather than a simple misunderstanding. The professional in him recognized the security implications, while the human being in him empathized with whatever desperation had driven her to this point. The morning sun climbed higher, casting longer shadows across the palace courtyard, and bringing the inevitable start of another busy royal day. Camilla knew that soon the palace would be bustling with staff, advisors, and officials who would learn of her attempted departure. The privacy and discretion she had hoped to maintain were slipping away with each passing minute. Morrison made the decision to escort her back toward the palace while Hayes remained at his post, but not before radiating for additional instructions from his superiors. The walk back through the gardens felt like a march of defeat for Camilla, each step taking her further from the freedom she had so desperately sought and closer to the gilded cage that royal life had become. The inspector's demeanor remained respectful throughout their journey back to the palace, but his firm guidance made it clear that she was no longer a free agent in this situation. Years of protocol training had prepared him for many scenarios, but escorting a royal family member back from an escape attempt was unprecedented in his experience. He found himself improvising a delicate balance between authority and deference. As they approached the palace's rear entrance, Morrison gently but firmly suggested that the suitcase would need to be examined for security purposes. This request felt like the final indignity to Camilla, the idea that her personal belongings would be searched as if she were a potential threat to the very institution she had served faithfully for years. Her protests were polite but ineffective against the implacable requirements of royal security. The examination of her belongings took place in a small, windowless room, typically used for security briefings. Morrison and another senior guard methodically went through each item in her suitcase, documenting everything as part of the official incident report. Camilla watched in silence as her carefully chosen possessions were laid out on the stark metal table, each item representing a piece of the life she had hoped to reclaim. The photographs were examined with particular interest, as security protocols required understanding any potential connections or destinations that might pose risks. Images of the French countryside, the cottage where she had planned to stay, and pictures of herself from happier times were all catalogued and noted. What had been precious memories to her became evidence in a security file. Among her clothing, the guards found the simple garments she had chosen to help her blend into ordinary life. The contrast between these modest pieces and her usual designer wardrobe spoke volumes about her desire to shed the trappings of royalty. Even her choice of a worn leather jacket and comfortable walking shoes told the story of someone desperate to disappear into anonymity. The travel documents revealed the extent of her planning, showing bookings for ferries, trains, and the small French hotel where she had intended to spend her first night of freedom. Morrison noted the thoroughness of her preparations while recognizing the profound sadness behind such elaborate planning for something as simple as personal liberty. Personal letters found in the suitcase created the most delicate situation for the security team. These private communications from friends and family members represented deeply personal relationships and thoughts that had no bearing on palace security, yet protocol demanded their review. Morrison handled these items with particular care, recognizing the invasion of privacy while acknowledging his professional obligations. The most poignant discovery was a small notebook filled with Camilla's handwritten thoughts and reflections. The pages revealed her inner struggle with royal life, her longing for privacy and normalcy, and her fears about losing herself completely to the demands of the monarchy. These intimate writings provided a window into her emotional state that explained everything about her desperate escape attempt. As the examination continued, Camilla found herself answering questions about her intentions, her planned destination, and any potential security risks associated with her journey. The interrogation was conducted with respect, but it remained an interrogation nonetheless, transforming her from a royal family member into a subject of security concern. In the space of a few hours, the final indignity came when Morrison explained that all of her belongings would need to remain in security, custody pending a full review of the incident. The items that represented her hope for freedom would become evidence in a case file, stored away in some palace vault until officials determined they posed no ongoing security risk. Her escape plan had not only failed, but had also cost her the few personal possessions that still felt truly her own. The news of Camilla's attempted departure reached Charles within an hour of the incident, delivered by his private secretary with the kind of careful diplomacy reserved for the most sensitive royal matters. The king received the information in his study, surrounded by the morning's official correspondence and briefing papers, the mundane business of monarchy, providing a stark contrast to the personal crisis now unfolding within his own family. Charles set aside his papers with deliberate calm, though his hands betrayed a slight tremor as he processed the implications of what had occurred. His wife of many years, his partner in the complex dance of royal duty, had been so desperate to escape their shared life that she had planned an elaborate departure without confiding in him. The pain of this betrayal cut deeper than any public criticism or political challenge he had ever faced. The private secretary remained standing at a respectful distance, waiting for instructions on how to proceed with what was clearly an unprecedented situation. Palace protocol offered no guidance for dealing with a royal family member's escape attempt, leaving everyone involved to navigate uncharted territory with nothing but their professional judgment and personal discretion to guide them. Meanwhile, in her private quarters, Camilla sat in stunned silence as the full weight of her failure settled over her. The room that had once felt like a sanctuary now seemed like a cell, its elegant furnishings and priceless artwork serving as beautiful but impassable barriers to the outside world. The morning that had begun with such hope and possibility had devolved into her worst nightmare of exposure and consequence. Her personal maid, Sarah, hovered nearby with obvious anxiety, torn between her loyalty to her mistress and her understanding that the situation had moved far beyond anything she could help resolve. The young woman had watched Camilla's spirits decline over recent months, but she had never imagined that her employer's unhappiness would lead to such a desperate measure. The telephone in Charles's study rang with increasing frequency as word of the incident spread through the upper levels of palace management. Each call brought new concerns about security protocols, potential media exposure, and the complex question of how to handle a situation that had no precedent in modern royal history. The king found himself managing a crisis that was both deeply personal and profoundly institutional. Palace staff moved with unusual urgency throughout the corridors, their hushed conversations and anxious expressions creating an atmosphere of barely controlled chaos. News of this magnitude could not be contained indefinitely, and everyone understood that decisive action would be needed to prevent the situation from spiraling completely out of control. The delicate balance between family privacy and institutional security hung in the balance. Dr. Harrison, the royal family's longtime personal physician, was quietly summoned to assess Camilla's mental and emotional state. His arrival at the palace went unnoticed by most staff, but his presence signaled the serious concern that her attempted escape had generated among those responsible for the family's well-being. The intersection of personal crisis and royal duty created complex questions about care, privacy, and security. In the security offices deep within the palace, Inspector Morrison filed his preliminary report while wrestling with the implications of what he had witnessed. His detailed account would become part of the official record, but he found himself struggling to capture the human dimension of the morning's events in the dry language of security protocols. The woman he had escorted back to the palace bore little resemblance to the composed public figure the world knew as the Queen Consort. Charles finally made the decision to go to Camilla personally, dismissing his staff and making his way through the familiar corridors toward their private quarters. The walk gave him time to process his emotions and consider how to approach a conversation that would determine the future of their marriage and potentially the stability of the monarchy itself. Years of public partnership had not prepared him for this moment of private reckoning. The reunion between husband and wife took place behind closed doors, away from the watchful eyes of staff and security personnel. What passed between them in those first moments remained private, but the emotional intensity was evident to anyone who glimpsed their faces afterward. Decades of shared experience, both triumph and struggle, hung in the balance as they confronted the gulf that had opened between them. Camilla's explanation of her actions came in halting sentences punctuated by tears she had held back for hours. The words poured out of her like water through a broken dam, years of suppressed frustration and longing finally finding voice in the safety of her husband's presence. Her description of feeling lost within the role of Queen Consort painted a picture of gradual suffocation by duty and expectation. Charles listened with growing understanding as his wife revealed the depth of her unhappiness and the desperate measures she had felt compelled to take. Her planned escape to France represented more than just a desire for privacy. It was an attempt to reconnect with the woman she had been before royal life reshaped her identity beyond recognition. The cottage in the French countryside had symbolized not just refuge but redemption of her authentic self. The conversation stretched on for hours as they examined the cracks that had developed in their relationship, and their shared approach to royal duty. What had begun as a crisis of personal freedom evolved into a deeper discussion about the cost of their position and the sacrifices they had made in service to the crown. Both recognized that Camilla's escape attempt was a symptom of larger problems that could no longer be ignored. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across their private sitting room, Charles and Camilla reached a tentative understanding about the changes that would be necessary to prevent future crises. The king's recognition of his wife's suffering marked a turning point in their relationship, but both understood that words alone would not be sufficient to repair the damage that had been done. The practical implications of the morning's events still loomed large, with security reports to be reviewed, staff concerns to be addressed, and the ever-present question of media exposure to be managed. Palace officials waited anxiously for guidance on how to proceed, understanding that the decisions made in the coming hours would have lasting consequences for the royal family and the institution they served. The seized belongings remained in security custody, each item serving as a tangible reminder of how close Camilla had come to walking away from royal life entirely. The photographs, clothes, and personal mementos that had represented hope for a different future now existed as evidence of a crisis that had shaken the very foundation of the modern monarchy. The emergency meeting convened in the palace's most secure conference room brought together the highest levels of royal household management. Private secretaries, security chiefs, and senior advisors gathered around the polished mahogany table, their faces reflecting the gravity of a situation that had no clear precedent in royal protocol. The air was thick with tension as they grappled with questions that touched the very heart of modern monarchy. Sir Edmund Rothwell, the king's principal private secretary, chaired the meeting with the kind of measured authority that comes from decades of navigating royal crises. His weathered features showed the strain of the morning's events as he outlined the immediate concerns: security implications, staff confidentiality, potential media exposure, and the complex question of how to support the Queen Consort while maintaining institutional stability. The head of palace security presented his preliminary assessment with military precision, detailing the security failures that had allowed the escape attempt to progress as far as it had. His analysis revealed gaps in overnight surveillance and highlighted the unprecedented nature of an internal threat posed not by outside forces, but by a family member desperate for freedom. The irony of protecting the royal family from themselves was not lost on anyone present. Dr. Harrison's confidential medical assessment painted a picture of someone suffering from what he termed institutional fatigue, a condition he had observed in other long-serving members of royal households. His recommendation for extended rest and reduced public duties carried significant implications for the monarchy's public schedule, but his primary concern remained Camilla's mental and emotional well-being rather than institutional convenience. The legal advisor raised delicate questions about the formal documentation of the incident, particularly regarding the seizure of personal belongings and the potential for future escape attempts. Royal law operated in a unique space between public duty and private rights, creating complex jurisdictional questions about how to balance individual liberty with institutional security requirements. While these discussions unfolded in the conference room, Camilla remained in her quarters under what could only be described as house arrest, though no one used such stark language. A discreet security presence had been established outside her rooms, ostensibly for her protection, but effectively preventing any further unauthorized departures. The elegant prison of royal life had become more literal than metaphorical. Charles spent the afternoon torn between his duties as king and his responsibilities as a husband, attending the emergency meetings while also trying to provide emotional support to his wife. The dual nature of his role created impossible conflicts as he found himself simultaneously the institutional authority responsible for preventing future escape attempts, and the caring partner trying to address the underlying causes of her desperation. The palace's communications team worked frantically to develop contingency plans for potential media exposure, crafting carefully worded statements that could explain away any leaked information about the morning's events. The official line would focus on routine security reviews and schedule adjustments, avoiding any mention of escape attempts or seized belongings that might trigger uncomfortable questions from royal watchers. As evening approached, The seized items from Camilla's suitcase were catalogued and stored in the palace's secure evidence vault, a sterile underground facility, typically reserved for investigating external security threats. The photographs of French countryside, the simple civilian clothes, and the handwritten journal entries were filed away like criminal evidence, transforming personal dreams into institutional documentation. Sarah, Camilla's loyal maid, faced intense questioning from security personnel about her role in the escape attempt. The young woman's obvious distress and genuine surprise at the morning's outcome convinced investigators that she had been unaware of the full scope of her mistress's plans. Nevertheless, her access to royal quarters would be reviewed and potentially restricted as part of enhanced security measures. The French authorities were discreetly contacted through diplomatic channels to cancel the hotel reservation and other arrangements Camilla had made for her planned refuge. This coordination required delicate handling to avoid creating an international incident or generating unwanted attention from foreign media outlets. The cottage owners would never know how close they had come to hosting one of Britain's most prominent royal figures. Inspector Morrison found himself at the center of discussions about reforming palace security protocols, his professional handling of the crisis earning recognition, while also highlighting systemic vulnerabilities. The experience of personally preventing a royal escape attempt would define the remainder of his career, though he remained deeply conflicted about his role in crushing someone's desperate bid for freedom. The evening brought no resolution to the fundamental questions raised by the day's events. Charles and Camilla's private conversations continued behind closed doors, their marriage and shared future hanging in the balance as they struggled to find a path forward that could accommodate both institutional requirements and personal happiness. The compromise between duty and desire seemed more elusive than ever. Palace staff moved through their evening routines with subdued efficiency, everyone aware that they had witnessed something extraordinary, but understanding that silence was both expected and essential. The network of confidentiality agreements and professional discretion that protected royal privacy had never been more crucial, as the exposure of this incident could destabilize public confidence in the monarchy. The seized belongings remained under lock and key, but their symbolic power transcended their physical presence. Every item represented a fragment of the life Camilla had hoped to reclaim, from the simple pleasures of anonymous travel to the deeper satisfaction of authentic relationships unburdened by protocol and expectation. The suitcase had carried more than clothes and documents. It had contained her dreams of redemption. As night fell over the palace, the building's ancient walls seemed to close in even more tightly around its royal inhabitants. The day's events had exposed the fundamental tension between the institution's need for control and the individual's desire for freedom, a conflict that had played out in various forms throughout centuries of royal history, but never quite so literally as in Camilla's desperate dash for the gates. The question that haunted everyone involved was whether this crisis would ultimately strengthen the royal family through honest acknowledgement of its costs, or whether it represented the beginning of a more serious institutional breakdown that could threaten the very foundations of modern monarchy. 3 weeks after the attempted escape, the palace had settled into an uneasy new routine that acknowledged the changed dynamics within the royal household. Camilla's public schedule had been drastically reduced under the guise of health concerns, allowing her the breathing space that Dr. Harrison had prescribed, while maintaining the facade of normalcy that palace life demanded. The compromise felt fragile to everyone involved, a temporary solution to what remained a fundamental problem. The security enhancements implemented after the incident were subtle but comprehensive, designed to prevent future escape attempts without creating the appearance of a prison. Additional surveillance cameras monitored previously unwatched corridors, new check-in protocols tracked the movements of family members, and staff access to royal quarters was more strictly controlled. The measures were explained as routine security upgrades, but everyone understood their true purpose. Charles had thrown himself into the challenge of rebuilding his relationship with Camilla, recognizing that their marriage's survival depended on acknowledging the legitimate grievances that had driven her desperate action. Their private conversations had evolved from crisis management to genuine soul-searching about the future they wanted to build together. The king found himself questioning assumptions about royal duty that he had never before examined. The seized belongings remained in secure storage, But their eventual return had become a point of ongoing negotiation between personal desire and institutional security. Each item required individual assessment for potential security risks, a process that felt absurdly bureaucratic when applied to photographs and personal letters. The delay in returning her possessions served as a daily reminder of how completely her privacy had been violated. Sarah had been transferred to different duties within the palace, a move officially described as a promotion, but understood by all as a security precaution. The young woman's new position kept her away from royal family members while maintaining her employment, but the change effectively ended her close relationship with Camilla. The personal cost of the escape attempt continued to ripple outward, affecting everyone who had been touched by the events of that morning. Inspector Morrison had been commended for his professional handling of the crisis, but the experience had left him questioning his own role in the royal protection system. His private conversations with colleagues revealed a man struggling with the ethics of preventing someone from seeking their own freedom, even when that prevention was technically his duty. The moral complexity of royal security had never been more apparent to him. The French cottage where Camilla had planned to find refuge remained unaware of its brush with royal history. The elderly couple who owned it continued their quiet rural life, occasionally wondering why their expected English guest had never arrived. The reservation had been cancelled through intermediaries, leaving no trace of the royal connection that had briefly brought international significance to their simple home. Palace communications teams had successfully contained public knowledge of the incident, but the strain of maintaining secrecy was evident in the careful choreography of every public appearance. Press releases were crafted with unusual precision, public schedules were adjusted to minimize scrutiny, and staff briefings emphasized the absolute necessity of discretion. The machinery of royal public relations had never been more thoroughly tested. The emergency protocols developed in response to the crisis had been quietly integrated into standard palace security procedures, creating lasting institutional changes that would affect future generations of royal family members. What had begun as a personal crisis had evolved into systemic reform. Though whether these changes represented improvement or further restriction remained a matter of perspective, Dr. Harrison's ongoing consultations with Camilla focused on developing coping strategies for the unique pressures of royal life. But their conversations often returned to the fundamental question of whether such pressures were inherently incompatible with mental health and personal happiness. His medical expertise was being stretched into philosophical territory as he tried to help someone adapt to circumstances that might be inherently maladaptive. The broader royal household had been shaken by the incident in ways that extended far beyond security concerns. Staff members who had devoted their careers to serving the royal family were forced to confront the possibility that their dedicated service might be contributing to the unhappiness of those they sought to protect. The cognitive dissonance was particularly acute among longtime employees who had witnessed the personal costs of royal duty firsthand. Charles's own schedule had been modified to allow more private time with Camilla, a change that required complex negotiations with government officials and palace administrators who were accustomed to maximizing royal availability for public duties. The king's insistence on prioritizing his marriage over marginal ceremonial obligations marked a subtle but significant shift in royal priorities that would have lasting implications for the institution. The investigation into security failures had concluded with recommendations for systematic reforms, but the deeper questions about the psychological sustainability of royal life remained unaddressed in official reports. The clinical language of security assessments could not capture the human dimension of what had occurred, leaving the most important lessons buried beneath bureaucratic analysis. Camilla's isolation within the palace had been somewhat alleviated by carefully managed visits from her children and close friends, but these interactions took place under discreet surveillance that reminded everyone of the changed circumstances. The spontaneity and privacy that had once characterized her personal relationships were now filtered through security considerations that added formality to even the most intimate conversations. The cottage in France continued to exist in her imagination as a symbol of the life she had almost claimed, its peaceful countryside and simple pleasures representing everything that royal existence had cost her. The fact that she would likely never see it again made the loss even more poignant. transforming an actual place into a mythical representation of roads not taken. As the weeks passed, both Charles and Camilla began to understand that their crisis had revealed truths about royal life that could not be unknown or ignored. The attempted escape had forced honest acknowledgement of costs that had previously been quietly accepted, creating an opportunity for genuine change if they had the courage to pursue it. The question remaining was whether the institution of monarchy could adapt to accommodate human needs without losing its essential character. 6 months after that fateful morning at the palace gates, a different kind of transformation had taken place within the royal household. The crisis that had threatened to tear apart both a marriage and an institution had instead become the catalyst for profound changes that no one could have anticipated. The attempted escape that had seemed like a catastrophic failure had evolved into something resembling redemption. Though the path had been neither straight nor simple, Camilla's belongings had finally been returned to her in a private ceremony that Charles insisted upon personally overseeing. The leather suitcase that had once represented desperate flight now sat in their private sitting room, its contents serving as reminders of a journey toward honesty rather than escape. The photographs, letters, and simple clothes had been transformed from evidence of rebellion into symbols of the authentic self that royal life had nearly erased. The cottage in France had taken on new significance in their lives, not as an escape destination, but as an annual retreat where they could spend time together away from the pressures of royal duty. Charles had quietly arranged for the royal family to rent the property for several weeks each year, allowing Camilla to experience the simple pleasures she had yearned for, while maintaining the security requirements that their positions demanded. The elderly French couple had been delighted to discover their mysterious guests were far more distinguished than they had ever imagined. Inspector Morrison had been promoted to head of personal royal security, his sensitive handling of the escape crisis having demonstrated qualities of judgment and compassion that his superiors recognized as essential for protecting a family rather than just an institution. His new role included consulting with family members about security arrangements that balanced protection with personal freedom, a revolutionary approach that treated royal family members as partners rather than subjects in their own safety. The security reforms implemented after the incident had evolved beyond simple prevention measures into a more sophisticated understanding of the relationship between institutional protection and personal liberty. New protocols allowed for limited private time and movement while maintaining overall security, recognizing that the greatest threat to royal family members might come from the isolation and constraint that total protection required. Sarah had requested and received a transfer back to personal service with Camilla, their relationship having deepened through the shared experience of that traumatic morning. The young woman's loyalty during the investigation and her genuine concern for her mistress's well-being had demonstrated the kind of personal devotion that made royal service meaningful rather than merely ceremonial. Their renewed partnership had become a model for how staff relationships could be both professional and authentically caring. Dr. Harrison's ongoing work with the royal family had expanded beyond individual consultation to include systemic analysis of how royal institutions could better support the mental health and personal well-being of their members. His recommendations had led to subtle but significant changes in scheduling, protocol, and support services that acknowledged the human cost of public service while maintaining the dignity and effectiveness of royal duties. The marriage between Charles and Camilla had emerged from their crisis stronger and more honest than it had been in years. The forced confrontation with Camilla's unhappiness had broken through years of polite accommodation and unspoken resentment, allowing them to rebuild their relationship on a foundation of genuine understanding rather than mere compatibility. Their private conversations had evolved from crisis management to authentic partnership in reimagining what their shared life could become. The broader implications of the incident had rippled through the entire royal institution, prompting quiet but significant reforms in how the monarchy balanced traditional obligations with contemporary understanding of personal rights and mental health. These changes were implemented gradually and discreetly, allowing the institution to evolve without appearing to abandon its essential character or responding to public pressure. The palace staff who had witnessed the morning's events had been bound by confidentiality agreements, but the experience had changed their understanding of their roles in profound ways. Many had begun to see their service not just as maintaining an institution, but as supporting individual human beings who carried extraordinary burdens. This shift in perspective had improved morale and job satisfaction throughout the household. Sergeant Hayes, the guard who had first confronted Camilla at the gates, had requested and received training in crisis intervention and mental health awareness. His recognition that his duties might involve protecting royal family members from themselves as much as from external threats had led to important changes in guard training that better prepared security personnel for the complex human dimensions of their work. The cottage in France had become more than just a retreat. It had evolved into a symbol of the possibility that duty and personal happiness need not be mutually exclusive. The weeks spent there each year allowed both Charles and Camilla to reconnect with aspects of themselves that royal life had obscured, returning to their official duties refreshed and more authentically engaged with their public roles. The leather suitcase now served a different purpose entirely, accompanying them on their annual trips to France filled not with desperate escape plans but with books, casual clothes, and personal items that supported relaxation rather than flight. The transformation of its symbolism from desperation to hope reflected the broader changes that had taken place in their lives and relationship. The incident had forced acknowledgement of truths about royal life that had long been ignored or politely overlooked, creating opportunities for reform that might never have emerged otherwise. The crisis had revealed that the greatest threats to the monarchy might come not from external forces but from the internal contradictions between institutional demands and human needs. As Camilla looked back on that morning 6 months later, she could see that her failed escape had actually been the beginning of a different kind of freedom. The courage to acknowledge her desperation had ultimately created space for authentic change, proving that sometimes the most important journeys begin with a single desperate step toward the gate, even when that gate remains forever closed. The touching tale had become one of redemption rather than rebellion, of institutional adaptation rather than personal defeat, and of love that could survive even the most profound challenges to its foundation.